Good morning to you. I'm Danilo Evangelista, and welcome to our discussion for February 3rd, 2024. We're now into the month of February, 1 month closer to the hurricane season, and we're also approaching on the 100-day mark to the hurricane season as well. So we're getting closer, that's for sure. So today, decided I wanted to bring back the old format because we have quite a bit to talk about today, especially with updated model data, updated climate models. They update and kind of refresh every single month to give us new data on the months ahead, and that applies this week for the case of hurricane season. We're going to talk about that, and of course, our typical things, including ENSO and current sea surface temperature anomalies. So glad to have you along. I'm going to start off with a visible shot of the United States. Not too much going on today. The first day, actually, for sunny weather here in New York City. We've actually gone through a streak of, I believe, 9 or 10 days since last month without any real sunshine. Today's the first day that it's sunny, and it definitely does look like a really good day out. This is associated with some sort of low pressure system that's kind of moving to the east. The subtropics in general right now is actually very active. We have multiple areas of low pressure that are moving through. Typical, especially in an El Nino winter, we tend to have an active subtropical jet, so we see a lot of these storms moving through. Still, though, nothing, unfortunately, in the way of any major snow events, and probably that will not be the case for at least the next week or so. So, unfortunate with that. Some weather over Texas and Louisiana today looks like they'll get some rain. This will actually develop into a low pressure system in the Gulf that will move into Florida tomorrow. And there's a slight risk in effect by the Storm Prediction Center in portions of southern Florida, probably, of course, for gusty winds and maybe some isolated tornadoes too. Other than that, though, that moves out, and it doesn't look like of anything of major consequence will be for the United States. So, kind of just getting that out of the way before we get to the rest of the stuff. Widening the view, though, into the Atlantic, typical of the off season, not a lot going out in the deep tropics. There's actually a lot of Saharan air out there, and yes, we do have Saharan air in the off season, not just in May, June, and July when we typically know them to have those kind of Saharan air outbursts. There was actually a big one about a week or so ago, or just this past week. But other than that, quiet. You see a bunch of these strong westerly winds, indicative of strong upper level westerlies, which is why the off season is usually the off season because there's a lot of shear and things are just not quite favorable for tropical development. Basically, why we have a hurricane season from June 1st to November 30th. Bottom line, what I'm trying to get at, nothing to happen within the next few weeks, I would assume. Of course, unless we get something random that kind of develops out here from a dying extratropical system, forms, it turns into some sort of subtropical system. That's typical. That happens sometimes, but not really often, and that doesn't seem like that'll happen over the next few weeks, at least what it seems like right now. Moving on, though, to NOAA coral reef watch sea surface temperature anomalies, as we do every single week. El Nino still out there in the Pacific, and it is holding on for dear life. We talked about last week a westerly wind burst event in the Pacific that's going to help the sea surface temperature anomalies remain just for the El Nino's sake of holding on quite literally for dear life. That's going to help. And we're certainly seeing that. El Nino still holding on strong. And the Atlantic is also very warm too. These anomalies off the northwestern African coasts and even off Western Africa too. 3 degrees Celsius in there as well. And we kind of want to draw your attention. I just noticed this. And this is more or less a big thing to watch, not only for hurricane season, but for severe weather season as well. Gulf of Mexico still warm too. This area in here, especially, I just looked at it with the actual sea surface temperatures. Very strong loop current kind of peaking up into the northern Gulf. I saw actual sea surface temperatures still being read at 26 degrees Celsius in portions of the central Gulf in February. So that is quite significant as well. And as I mentioned, not only for hurricane season will this be important, but for severe weather season as well. The warmer Gulf we have, the more moisture that could be kind of brought in to the southeast, especially when we have these big systems that move through from the west and drive up moisture from the south and creates the severe weather outbreaks we typically get during severe weather season. That's actually coming up in just about a few weeks as well. A lot more short term than hurricane season, so that'll be something else to watch too. And don't mention this enough, but the Caribbean is also very warm and will probably remain warm over the next few weeks as well. And I actually have specific data to point that out too, which we'll go over in a little bit. Did though kind of want to shift things around, and I do this from time to time, and I like to do this. Comparisons from years past. This time, I'm only gonna do this time how it looked from this time last year, and just honestly, just kind of going back and forth between these tabs. All I need to know is just looking at them side by side. Huge differences. It's almost as if it's two completely different worlds, obviously. This time last year, 2023, we had the dying La Nina, triple dip La Nina. That was dying out, and El Nino was coming in, and the Pacific was a whole lot colder than it was this year. And even the Atlantic, too, that was not as warm. And this is crazy to think about. We had such a very warm subtropical Atlantic, but out here in the deep tropics wasn't as warm quite yet. And last year, we obviously ended up seeing a record breaking warm Atlantic, not only in the deep tropics, but also out towards the subtropical and northern Atlantic as well. And just to see how it compares to this time last year compared to now, we are definitely worlds much warmer, and that'll be something interesting to look at for the current season ahead. And I'm gonna show you the Nino 3.4. Obviously, we're in El Nino, 1.8 degrees Celsius. That's the current value. This is NOAA Coral Reef Watch, so basically the same as this, just taking a look at it as an average map over the Nino 3.4. Has rebounded slightly, and of course, that is because of our westerly wind burst event over the Pacific. Really not going to do much but help this hold on for a little bit longer while the MDR2 that's also beginning to rebound. And look at that since November. Said this before, but we're basically as warm as we can be right now in the Atlantic, and we have been for what'll probably be coming up on about a year now that the Atlantic has been extremely warm, and it does not seem like that'll go away anytime soon. And once again, I do have model data, not only climate model, long range data, but seasonal weekly model data too, over the next few weeks to prove this is not going away, and this will be something for sure that we need to watch ahead of the hurricane season for sure. SOI though, as again I mentioned, we have a westerly wind burst event going on, so the daily contribution to the SOI negative 22. So definitely westerly winds occurring in the Western Pacific right now. And of course, that has tanked the SOI average from positive to now near neutral. And the 90-day average is also tanked too. We're at -3, and earlier we were only at -1.78, roughly a few weeks ago, towards the end of last month. So there's definitely some sort of atmospheric response that's still there with this El Nino, but it's definitely on its way out soon, eventually. And something interesting to mention that Eric Webb mentions, this is actually kind of typical for El Nino to do this, but I'll mention that in just a little bit. But yeah, westerly wind bursts. This is the zonal wind anomalies from the GFS ensembles, and we run it out from now all the way till the end of the forecast run along the equatorial Pacific. These reds here indicative of westerly winds coming out of the west compared to average, and that continues for basically the rest of the forecast run all the way out till mid-February. So there will definitely be some sort of driving mechanism that'll keep this El Nino there. And going to what Eric Webb said, he does actually mention that westerlies from El Nino itself actually help terminate El Nino events. Because he mentions it's usually from negative feedbacks related to the development of the South Pacific convergence zone, which we mentioned last week, and the southern shifts of the zonal winds, and of course other typical ocean current processes that reflect, and eventually we end up getting El Nino to kind of dissipate. So basically, what he's saying Towards the end of El Nino events, sometimes is when we get these westerly wind events that basically kill the El Nino itself instead of getting the big easterly trade bursts that we know that help to really strengthen and kickstart La Niñas, especially because trades tend to upwell the waters along the surface. So, very interesting indeed. And as I mentioned before, it's all part of a process that's going to continue to happen over the next few weeks. And I will assure you, and so will the climate model data too, that La Nina is definitely on the way for sure this year at some point. How strong? That is still something that is in question. Really quickly though, this is also more zonal wind anomaly data. This time it's for the deep tropics of the northern hemisphere, and I want to focus you on this region specifically. This is the Atlantic. And notice we also have a westerly wind burst ongoing there too, especially in the Caribbean. So remember earlier when I mentioned that the Caribbean will probably stay warm? Probably will, because westerly winds, once again, they help upwell, they kind of help keep the waters along the surface warm, and that is very prominent in the Caribbean too. Look at these anomalies too, all the way towards the end of the scale. So very strong westerly winds expected in the Caribbean over the next several weeks, and that continues as well through the general Atlantic through the end of the time frame. So going back to that idea, the Atlantic does not seem like we will have any sort of mechanism to keep the Atlantic from being as warm as it is right now, and probably warming up even further. We're not seeing some of these blues here, which is stronger than normal trade winds, and that would help kind of cool the Atlantic and upwell the warm waters along the surface. That is not happening in the Atlantic, especially in the Atlantic deep tropics. So that means there will be no force or no mechanism that'll be there to cool down the Atlantic once again, especially from the levels that it was. And even the cooling we had just recently over a week or so ago when we saw that Saharan air come in, that Saharan air outbreak, even then it didn't cool down much at all or do much damage in the first place. And now we're having this. It's going to be an interesting several weeks, especially as we get towards hurricane season. And the GEFS is not the only one that keeps these westerly winds persistent in the Atlantic. I'm going to show you the CFS weeklies. And yeah, the CFS is typically referred to as the can't forecast you know what model, but it actually, to its credit, the weeklies have not really been bad this year so far, and they have done pretty well, especially with detecting a sort of pattern change that we would see come, which is going to happen this month. We're going to go back towards a more negative North Atlantic oscillation. For basically those that don't know, high pressures over Greenland, and once again in active subtropics with the subtropical jet, and that helps keep these westerly winds going. And over the next few weeks here, just gonna kind of take it out in time. The CFS weeklies, notice these reds, they're persistent all the way from February 10th. This is mid-February, and now we're in the last half of February into March. This is week 4. Look at that, still persistent too. And I'll even take this out into early March, the CFS, and even into mid-March. This is going from March 9th to March 16th, all the way out to the end of the run. The CFS keeps these westerly winds, these oranges going, and that is westerly wind, zonal winds compared to normal. And that should help keep the Atlantic warm. And definitely wouldn't shock me if we get even warmer. And can't imagine how that'll look like. That'll probably be reds. Let's go back to this map. That'll probably be these kind of oranges and deep reds kind of spreading throughout the entire deep tropics. And at that point, from the CFS forecasts, that goes out to mid-March. At that point, we'll only be 2.5 months away. 2.5 months away? Yeah, 2.5 months away from the season. Then definitely a decreasing time frame, and all of these factors continuing to move up into time. And I'm going to show you right now, those climate models expect that these factors, such as the warm Atlantic, that'll continue and persist into the hurricane season. Really quickly, though, the CFS for the precipitation, this is the new climate model data as of February 1st, and this is for the hurricane season. And all you need to know is all these these greens here in the tropics, that is precipitation. And you can kind of see it too, almost as if it's a track from the deep tropics of the MDR into the Caribbean and Gulf. A lot of people don't like to always use that kind of data to pinpoint tracks, but definitely interesting. You kind of see if almost if this is a trajectory from the MDR into the Caribbean and Gulf. But bottom line, lots of greens representative of a lot of precipitation in the MDR and the deep tropics. So that means there'll probably be a lot of rising air. And CFS is not alone too. CANSIPS as well shows the same thing. They have the entire MDR and Caribbean with a bunch of these greens, probably strong tropical waves, rising ocean, very important, especially because we see these greens in the deep tropics. That's where the most of the activity obviously happens, and that's where we look for when it comes to a favorable hurricane season. That's where we look for the development typically. And the fact that we do see these greens there in the typical regions that we look for tropical development, that is a sign that maybe these climate models just might be picking up on potentially things to be favorable in the Atlantic basin. And this is not to say, because the other climate models are coming out, such as the NMME and even the Euro seasonal, that's coming out in a few days. And maybe I'll post an update on that during the week when they do happen, when they do come out and release to the public. Maybe I'll post about that really quickly, kind of like a YouTube short, but I'm pretty sure though them too will show the same thing. And just again, just going to show the pieces of the puzzle, as I like to call it, they're falling in line for the hurricane season, and these greens throughout the deep tropics, they definitely represent something that is absolutely favorable for the Atlantic. And that's not to show the sea surface temperature anomalies, because first of all, what is it that we're looking for? Because obviously we're looking at something that we see in the models, but if we don't know what to look for, then we're just kind of just looking at models and just reading off what's happening. But what are we looking for, especially in terms of an active season in the Atlantic? And I'm telling you what we're looking for these warms, these oranges, to be in portions such as the deep tropics of the Atlantic. And what do you notice? This is the CANSIPS. And I'm not going to bring the CFS up because that would make this video probably 30, 40 minutes long. And if you like that, maybe I'll do it next time. But anyways, what is it showing? What are we looking for? We're looking for warm anomalies in the Atlantic, especially in the deep tropics. What is it showing? Just that. And in fact, you know how I always mention the AMO, the positive AMO signature, which is a horseshoe that kind of comes from the northern Atlantic down into the deep tropics, and the CANSIPS from February for August to October, this far out. That is probably the most defiant signal you could get in terms of a warm, hyperactive Atlantic signature. And once we get to April and May, we'll probably see people like Philip Klotzbach mention this. They'll bring up the analogs from hyperactive seasons, and you'll notice just how much this aligns with those years that tend to be very active. It's really an alarming signal and something that we'll have to watch for sure as we go into the future. Um, moving away from the Atlantic though, because ENSO, El Niño and La Niña, is also an important factor to bring up when it comes to hurricane season talk as well. That's one of the main factors we look at, whether or not each year we'll have an El Niño and a La Niña. And I saved this from February. This is from Thursday, February 1st, when the first run from the CFS came out. And I didn't bring up today's run because, you know, the CFS does update weekly. But it's only been 2 days since February 1st, so I'm pretty sure they're probably showing the exact same thing from the CFS, but decided to save February 1st, and just for fun, just to see how, you know, things change from month to month, just to prove that things can still change from now till the hurricane season. I'll probably save the run from when we get to March 1st, and then we'll look back and see it and kind of compare and contrast the two and see, did things change? But I'm probably sure we probably won't see that much change between now and March, as it pretty much does seem like the picture is kind of set. Even though it's far out, the picture definitely seems like it is set for this year. And that is, look at this, from now where we are with this very strong El Nino, the CFS rapidly weakens it from now all the way till spring, And by the time we get to July, so this is the middle of the summer, we're already in the negative territory, -1 to be exact in Celsius, by the way. In the tropical Pacific, this is with the Nino 3.4, by the way, and -1, that is already moderate La Nina territory. And they show that by the time we get to July and we go further into October, this is taking it down all the way to -2 degrees Celsius. So the CFS has a strong La Nina forecast for this year. So that is definitely very interesting indeed. And that'll be interesting to see how things kind of change. Even though the CFS, I did hear sometimes it does tend to have some sort of bias with extreme changes to patterns, especially like El Nino. They kind of bring this very rapidly into strong La Nina category. The bottom line I think we got to take away from this, though, is they show us transitioning from an El Nino to La Nina, and the CANCIP does that too. Didn't bring up the CANCIPs today, again, for the sake of time, but they show that too, and so do most of the other climate models as well. The picture is being set. I'm gonna close these notifications, by the way. Kind of weird to have notifications on the screen, but back to what I was saying. The picture is being set. It's there. A lot of the models agree it. There's a lot of agreements. That's the most important thing, because we could have something that one model shows, but if it's completely different from what another model shows, there's disagreements, and that kind of leads to a more blurry picture, especially when it comes to climate models long range. But long range right now, they're all agreeing on the same thing: warm Atlantic, and most importantly, us transitioning from a La Nina. But even the La Nina, honestly, isn't that important, especially considering the fact that we honestly really just don't need an El Nino, and that'll be it. I mean, sometimes we look at these big hurricane seasons, and we could actually talk about this a little bit more another time, but just to really quickly mention, and something you should always remember, the biggest thing is when it comes to Enzo is the fact of, will we have an El Nino or not? And even if we don't have a La Nina, if we're neutral, and as long as we're not in an El Nino, that is honestly a green signal for the Atlantic to have an active season, because we're not seeing any sort of suppressive sort of atmospheric setup that we would typically get in an El Nino. That is not really the case in a neutral. It's neutral. The atmosphere is more or less in a neutral state. Um, and those years sometimes where we tend to be in sort of neutral, sometimes leaning towards the cooler side, but still in a neutral ENSO, those years sometimes do tend to be pretty historic active hurricane seasons as well. So the bottom line that we got to take away is that the models don't show an El Nino, definitely don't. And even this year, kind of as a bonus, you could say a lot of them do make this ENSO kind of transition quickly from an El Nino into even La Nina territory this year. And really quickly, just to kind of show that obviously other models show this too. This is the probabilistic ENSO forecast. This is from the CPC, the Climate Prediction Center. This is their mid-January forecast. And the biggest time frame we gotta watch here, August, September, October. And look at that, the highest probability for an ENSO event is La Nina. That's the blue, and this is for the peak hurricane season. So kind of showing that's not the only thing, that the CFS is not the only model showing this sort of picture into La Nina, and also that things are just falling in line. The models are all showing a very active look into the Atlantic, lots of precipitation in the deep tropics, most importantly, and of course, no El Nino expected for this year, definitely not. In fact, of course, models bring this to La Nina as well. So lots of things to look out for. Definitely a very interesting look to the hurricane season this year. We're still roughly about 120 days away from the season, so we still have quite a bit of time to get from now till June 1st. But trust me, that time will soon run out and the hurricane season will be upon us soon. Especially this month is February. It's the shortest month of the year. Yes, we do have a leap year this year, so we have an extra day added to February, but it's still gonna go by quickly. And trust me, before you know it, we're gonna be upon the hurricane season. And as long as these models continue to show, these climate models continue to show what they show now, from now into March and April, it pretty much does look set that the pattern will be favorable for a hurricane season that could be pretty active, pretty darn active to say honestly, for this year. Definitely things though to still watch as we head into the future. That does it though for this week. If you like what you saw, again, I really, really encourage you like, comment, subscribe, share with family and friends. I've been getting a lot of new followers within recent weeks, and I thank you so much for that. It really means a lot to me, and hopefully we can continue to grow further as we get towards hurricane season. Obviously, the more, the merrier, as they say. Thanks for watching though, and I'll see you soon.